from the Undergraduate Research Symposium. My name is Paul Peppis. I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center and an English professor at the University of Oregon. This panel is called The Fate of the Humanities, and it features this year's cohort of the Humanities Undergraduate Research Fellowship Program, which is a collaboration between the Office of the VP for Research and Innovation, the Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program, and the Oregon Humanities Center. We have 8 panelists, so that's a lot. I'll just introduce each of them one at a time as they go. We're going to save all our questions verbally till the end of all of the speakers. However, using the Q&A function, if you'd like to type a question to each or any of the speakers as we go, you should feel free to do that. All right, everybody, are you all ready, panelists? It's great to have you here. These are going to be really wonderful papers. I'm totally excited. So our first speaker today is Bita Habashi. Welcome, Bita.
Thank you, Dr. Peppis. Let me just share my presentation. Is that coming up okay?
We can see it.
Perfect. Hello, my name is Bita Habashi, and my thesis is focused on the representation of Middle Eastern women writers in high school curricula. The research questions that I pose are which women writers of Middle Eastern descent might high school teachers add to their language arts curriculum, and what approaches can teachers take to presenting these writers and reading their works with students? Before we begin, some background information is just some definitions we should all know, beginning with Islamophobia. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word means intense dislike or fear of Islam, especially as a political force, or hostility or prejudice towards Muslims. I add to this idea stating that lack of knowledge around Middle Eastern cultures in general works against curing Islamophobia. The next definition is anti-racist teaching, which is an intentional pedagogy that creates or develops racial equity with applications for face-to-face and remote and hybrid teaching environments. Critical literacy, as well as a framework encouraging teachers to reconsider literacy instruction as problem-posing education, where the relationships between hegemony, power, and literacy are questioned at the same time that literacy skills are being taught and learned. And finally, critical pedagogy, which is the understanding of diverse forms of oppression and overall promotes an understanding of how issues of power and oppression are embodied in everyday human life experiences. This provides a basis for questioning various ideologies and related decisions and the dominance relations that they protect. The methodology that I've conducted for this project is as follows. I've compiled a reading list of 10 novels by women writers of Middle Eastern descent to be taught within high school curricula. I've also conducted a close reading analysis of 4 novels on said list in order to display methods of teaching the thematic aspects of the novels, as well as the cultural and societal effects that occur during teaching of the novels. I've also provided context to implementing these novels into curriculum through use of pedagogy theory already being amplified through modern day inclusivity movements. Specifically using theoretical framework in line with anti-racist teaching and teaching using gender and queer theory as a resource for the liberation of Middle Eastern women writers. The novel list that I posed for this project is as follows. So Persepolis by Marjan Satrapi, The Queue by Basma Abdelaziz, A Very Large Expanse of Sea by Tahara Mafi, Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga, Reading Lolita in Tehran by Azar Nafizi, Where the Streets Had a Name by Randa Abdel Fattah, The Turtle of Oman by Naomi Shihab Nye, and Salt Houses by Hala Ilyan, Home Fire by Camilla Shanzi, and We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faisal. So why these novels? These novels have all been selected with regard to popular genres and themes already common in high school curricula, such as the dystopian novel, the coming of age novel, and novels including religious or spiritual themes. The difference, however, lies in relation to Middle Eastern cultures and the conscious teaching of these cultures in order to, 1, separate the idea of a monolith culture in the Middle East, and 2, highlight the experiences of women in the Middle East and encourage students to gain a respect for what it takes to be a novelist in a culture that avoids these women. Along with this, these novels are accessible to educators and are offered in English translations for those published out of the country. As a more general understanding of purpose, these novels work to expand the current literary canon of what's being taught in high school curriculum. The novels for close reading that I chose are A Very Large Expanse of Sea, Other Words for Home, Persepolis, and The Queue. The 4 novels that have been chosen for close reading analysis each replicate one of the popular genres aforementioned. A Very Large Expanse of Sea by Tahara Mafi being coming of age, as well as Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga, both taking place in America with protagonists from Iran and Syria. Persepolis by Marjan Satrapi is a graphic novel that covers cultural and religious themes in the times of the Iranian Revolution. The Queue by Basma Abdelaziz is a dystopian novel taking place in a Middle Eastern city, often compared to novels like 1984 by George Orwell or even The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood in its focus on amplifying specific struggles of women within dystopian societies. Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga is a novel written for middle grade readers. However, it covers topics that students in early high school will be able to relate to. I also recommend it be taught in comparison to A Very Large Expanse of Sea by Tahara Mafi due to the similarity in coming of age thematic aspects, but also due to the differences in Iranian versus Syrian cultures living in America in a post 9/11 society, and the deeper maturity levels in Mafi's novel compared to a younger protagonist in Warga's novel. So in regards to separating the monolithic view of the Middle East, the novels chosen all come from different countries in the Middle East. As shown here, there are a multitude of different countries within the Middle East and reflect different cultures as a result. The novels I have chosen vary with authors from many different countries to provide diversity within the reading list itself. For example, the 4 novels I have chosen for close reading reflect authors and protagonists from Iran, like Tahara Mafi and Marjan Satrapi, Egypt, like Basma Abdelaziz, and Syria, like Jasmine Warga. But on the reading list as a whole, there are authors from other countries as well, such as Hafsa Faisal, who is from Arabia and centers her novel around Arabian mythology, and Naomi Shihabnia, who is from Oman and centers her novel around immigration to the United States. In regards to the expansion of the literary curriculum canon, it is illusionary to simply assign reading lists of current canon and does not contribute to a higher learning curve. Expansion with a focus on inclusivity encourages students to understand why their coursework is being assigned and engages them in the material through higher understanding of what and why they are learning about these readings. Conscious, informed teaching helps students understand more background, not only on why they should care about what they are reading, but why what they are reading is important to society as a whole. Middle Eastern individuals are often used in storytelling as characters that stereotype a single story arc, whether that be an oppressed woman with no autonomy or cruel individuals tied to terrorism or violence. There are no means to highlight anything positive or beautiful about the different cultures and traditions of countries in the Middle East. This goes further into relating to Middle Eastern women in stories who are portrayed by white authors or male-identifying Middle Eastern authors. Often this contributes to stereotypes about the culture itself without giving voices to the women who have thoughts and individual value. Whether or not these women have a husband, have a faith, or have cultural traditions separate from religion and marriage as a whole, they have autonomy and ability to speak and write for themselves about protagonists that will be beneficial to young students gaining a respect for different cultures and genders. Turning Middle Eastern women and their stories into fictional narratives for dramatized shock value of the real trauma they face is rooted in systemic oppression normalized in many American novels. Reading the writing of Middle Eastern women, whether through their memoirs and nonfiction narratives or through the fictional universes they have created to tell their stories and use their voices, is an agent in providing those questioning opportunities. Reading their writings begins to create a means to reconcile the way that they have been misrepresented and actively works against the sexism and racism that dehumanizes these Middle Eastern women. These works in particular begin to create those opportunities in ways relatable to students. As an example of the close reading that I've done in my paper, here's an excerpt from my paper. The quote in the square panel is from Persepolis by Marjan Satrapi, which is the graphic novel in my paper. The quote reads, "I didn't really know what to think about the veil. Deep down, I was very religious, but as a family, we were very modern and avant-garde." In order to teach just this panel, we take a look at the contrast of Black and white in the panel. On the left, there is Marjan's logical side in Black, with her dressed normal in a contrasting white that symbolizes the bright and modern traditions her ideals uphold, even while holding religion deep within her. The right side is a direct contrast. The religious side of her is apparent and shown on her body through the dark veil, with the light and beautiful background resembling vines and nature-centered imagery. In a classroom, this brings up the conversation about culture versus religion, and how one can live a life following cultural traditions but not be outwardly religious or coincide with the religion that multitudes of cultures follow. Specifically relating to the Middle East, the discussion sparks about the veil itself, along with the religion that requires the veil, the different types of veils that exist in different cultures, such as a burqa versus a hijab, and more generally, what it means to wear a veil at all. As far as implementation, this work is a call to action for educators. Through research, knowledge, and intention of anti-racist teaching, as well as intersectional teaching through gender theory, these novels and authors can be celebrated in high school curricula. As a result, we will be allowing space for students' reading and writing abilities to advance through theoretical and critical thinking. My references are as followed, and I would like to thank Dr. Kara Clevenger, my faculty mentor, Carl Reasoner, Dr. Paul Peppis, Gina Turner, and the whole Humanities Undergraduate Research Fellowship, as well as the University of Oregon for funding this project. And if you have any questions, I can open that up in the Q&A, and thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Bita. A fascinating presentation. Our next presenter is Kira Seretan. Sorry, Kira, you're up.
All right, thank you, Dr. Peppis. Let me just share that. All right, can everyone see that?
Yep.
All right. Hello, my name is Kira Seretan, and I will be presenting on split diminutives, a study of truncation patterns in American English speakers with varying linguistic backgrounds. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that all means in just a minute. I worked with Professor Volia Kapuscinski as my mentor, so thank you to him and the Department of Linguistics for their help with this. The research question that I was exploring is, do individuals with different linguistic backgrounds truncate or shorten English words using different rules? So that would look something like the examples below, where Willie would be a truncation of William, or techie would be a truncation of technology, where a shorter form is taken to represent a longer word. A lot of the background I used for this involved truncation patterns in various different languages, such as Chinese, or different dialects of English, such as Australian English. And I also looked a lot at primary stresses in English, as that has shown to be a very productive tool for patterning different things within a language, as we'll talk a little bit more about later. Australian English truncation specifically is a highly productive practice. It appears a lot for Australian English words. So there was a lot of material to work for there on what kinds of things influence the creation of truncations. I began with a questionnaire, which had a lot of different questions involving language backgrounds. So what kind of languages do you speak? What do your parents speak? What are your experiences with different languages? Things like that. And then I gave two different randomly assigned tests that involved stimuli having to do with syllables, things like rise pattern, which I'll explain a little more in a moment, the final forms that these truncations would take, different stresses within a word, and the locations of different consonant clusters. These were all given as pseudo words or invented words, which in order to avoid any kind of biases that may exist with pre-existing words or with known truncations thereof. And they were also all spelled out phonetically and given in recordings so that they could hear pronunciation, stress, things like that. This was also all given through Qualtrics, so there was no face-to-face presentation or any kind of in-person study done. So there are several reasons that stresses and consonant clusters were chosen to be the two tests that were assigned. Stress in a word has a lot of perceptual salience, so it's more prominent acoustically, it sticks out to the ear more. And then for consonant clusters, different clusters, especially paired with the diminutive, which is the Y at the end of the word that you'll see in a lot of the truncations, have different effects on whether or not they would be preferred. So things like L and R, as you can see here on the right side, as second consonants would be more frequently preceding a Y in English than things like M and W would be. We also would expect to see first syllables retained, regardless of the test, in that they're the first heard and they carry a lot more information in order to identify the word. So something like cap would be more easily identifiable as a truncation for captain, things like that. Stress in particular has a lot of traits that make it highly productive. So you're more likely to retain stressed syllables. They attract the ear more. They're louder, longer, higher pitched, that kind of thing. Vowels become more distinct when stressed. They have a tendency to all go down to the same kind of sound when in an unstressed syllable, but they each have their own individuality when they are stressed, which would mean that for producing an unstressed vowel, should an unstressed syllable be chosen for a truncation, would require a decision to be made on the part of the participant. This would look something like if the word is shepidwath, that is a lot more identifiable as an I than shepidwath. These are examples of some of the pseudo words that were used in the test. Stressed syllables also retain more word identity and make that original word more identifiable. Cross-linguistically, we know that stressed syllables are more likely to be preserved and not just within truncations. And then having a forced shift in stress would require the participant to make that decision, as if they chose an unstressed syllable, they would be required to shift that stress as there would be a stress in the final truncation. So these are some examples of the questions that were given for the consonant cluster test. As you can see, each example has of the truncation has an option for a single consonant or two consonants retaining that second consonant. So they would see a pseudo word as is given here in the full word, and then they would have a choice of truncations to make. A legal rise would be, in this case, something like that R would be allowed to follow that B generally in English, but an illegal rise is a W be less preferred to follow that B. And then as you can see with the manipulation, this just shifted the location of the consonant cluster within the word. Similarly, the same kinds of questions were given for the test that tested the first versus second syllable stresses. But in this case, there was always only one consonant given, but it would have been based on the first or second syllable. Here you can see how this would interact. So the first versus second syllable would dictate whether or not different consonants would be included, whether or not different vowels would be included. For example, for a more common cluster, if the second syllable was taken, this would include certain consonants. And then if the first syllable was taken, for example, in one of the manipulated sets, this would actually include one of the consonants, but not the other words. It would not be included in a common cluster over a rare cluster, because that would just be contained as part of that second syllable. There were a great variation in data. However, we will be discussing only statistically significant results here. We used hierarchical regression models to test statistical significance and use subjects and words as random effects, which would mean that when generalized, new subjects and words from the same population should still have the same patterning and could be seen across a wider scope. As I mentioned, we tested for effects of variation on consonant clusters and on stress placement. And we saw across the board relatively strong first syllable preference, as we had expected, but we also saw a strong statistical significance of effects of variation in stress as well. For consonant clusters, we did see the R and L favored retention and were much more likely to be retained than W and M as second consonants when followed by that diminutive Y. R and L more commonly occur before Y, both in the data and in English in general. So there was a significant but not large effect in this. As you can see in this graph on the side, a wider bar means that it occurred more often within the stimuli. And then the more of the light color there is, that would mean that 2 consonants were retained, whereas the dark color is only 1 consonant retained. So you can see that L and R retained both consonants much more often when they were the second consonant than M and W did. For the syllable stresses, both sides show that whether it's a first or second syllable stress, generally that first syllable was preferred, as most of these points are below 0.5 on both sides. However, as everything here is above that dotted line, you can see that second syllables were chosen almost only when there was a second syllable stress. So the effects of stress on English truncation is evidently highly statistically significant. Effects are consistent across subjects, but were not necessarily consistent within subjects, so the same subject did not always make the same decisions. Retention of consonant clusters showed a smaller effect, but were often dependent on the second consonant. So as you can see with this chart here for stresses, that first syllable was chosen a significantly higher portion of the time than that second syllable was, regardless of the properties of the original word. However, within the original word, there are different properties that had different effects. For example, if there was a tense vowel in the second syllable, and that would be something like E or A, something which would stick out to the ear much more than something like I or that had a much stronger effect. So as you can see here on the top right, that when there was that tense vowel, that second syllable was chosen much more often than the top left here when there was no tense vowel. And so across the board, as you can see on the bottom left, the first syllable was chosen over the second syllable when the first syllable was stressed, regardless of whether or not there was a tense vowel in that second syllable. But when a second syllable was chosen, was stressed as on the bottom right, though the first syllable is still preferred, the second syllable occurs as a choice significantly higher amount of the time. There is a lot of future research that could be done on this. Some things that might be looked at would be something like a larger sample size, more languages as background, or more specific languages, as a lot of the data give a wide scope of languages, but not necessarily concrete groups. Also, it would also be interesting to look at truncation patterns in languages other than English and their interactions with each other, as well as, for example, dialectal variations of English, especially as it has been theorized that, that English would show the same patterns regardless of dialect. And then productions showing choice, as these were given only as forced choice, it would be interesting to see a production test, which would show just kind of any truncation that the person would think of based on the word, or truncation similarly without the diminutive Y. I used a lot of background research for this, so thank you to all of my references. And I would also like to thank Professor Volya Kapuscinski, the University of Oregon Linguistics Department, my classmates and peers also for bouncing ideas off of. Thank you to the Humanities Undergraduate Research Fellowship for their funding, and especially to Carl Reisner for his help on this project, and thank you to the University of Oregon. I will take questions in the Q&A and at the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kira. Another really interesting paper. Our next speaker is Maya Ward. Maya, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Peppis. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So my presentation is on section 1557 and transgender healthcare. And my research question is, how does intentional language use affect access to quality healthcare for transgender patients? And what change in language use or policy could benefit transgender patients? So these are some main background that you need to know before we go into the presentation. The main analysis form that I used throughout this paper is discourse analysis, which instead of a broader content analysis takes specific excerpts and does an in-depth textual analysis to show cultural, political, and social implications of how the language is used in context. The key concepts that I analyzed through this discourse analysis are pronouns, gender dysphoria, burden on the basis of sex, discrimination, binary, and gender identity. And then more broadly, the specific document that I'm analyzing is the Affordable Care Act. So originally published by the Obama administration in 2014, in theory, this act covers uninsured Americans and prevents insurance companies from denying coverage due to pre-existing conditions. And then within the Affordable Care Act, the specific documents that I analyzed were Section 1557, which is the non-discrimination patient protection clauses, both under the Obama and Trump administrations, as Section 1557 changes in between the two. So the way that I went about this project, first is the methodology. As I said, is a discourse analysis. So that's a close textual analysis, analyzing how language affects the cultural and political implications. The software that I use to do this is called Deduce, which is a mixed method software program that basically allows me to break down these 900-page documents and analyze specific language use. And it's both qualitative and quantitative, which is nice because I can break down the specific language use and then see more broadly the patterns and generalizations and numbers, which was helpful in analyzing the broader context and doing a discussion and conclusion. So the process that I did is for each of those key concepts that I explained earlier, I looked at every single time they were used within both the Obama and Trump administration documents. And I found 8 to 10 excerpts that I thought most holistically represented the language use. Then I analyzed 3 to 5 through a 6-step analysis that I'll explain on the next slide. And the results were that I found 3 categories which most differed in the way that they analyzed and used language between the Trump and the Obama administrations. And those were gender, discrimination, and sex. And all of this project analysis was based upon trying to create a systematic review that helped to recognize the social spaces that I occupy. As a white cisgendered woman, there is a lot of blind spots that I have in analyzing transgender healthcare, and also transgender healthcare as itself is a complicated system because there's a lot of complexities within the community. So obviously I will have blind spots in analyzing this, but I'm hoping that this systematic review can help to minimize that in some space. So that 6-step analysis that I talked about with the discourse is from James Paul McGee. He's a scholar in discourse analysis. And the way that it breaks down is first you look at significance, which is basically the situated meaning of the language. And then you look at how that affects practices in practical applications with language use, whose identities that language use validates and whose it doesn't, and what relationships it builds between the language use and the practical application of the language, but also how that affects relations in the actual world. And then how the language use affords social goods to some and takes it away from others. And then what connections are built between the meaning and the cultural context and the language use. So just as an example of how I went about this, I'm going to show you how I did this with one of the excerpts for pronoun use. So under the Trump administration, I have an example here of pronoun use. And as you can see, the significance is they are classifying pronouns as an elementary sex-based classification and are building practices that therefore only work within this narrow definition of how to use pronouns. Validating the identities of those that work within this elementary sex-based classification and invalidating the identities of those that don't, and therefore building relationships between the ideas of proper healthcare and using pronouns only at this very elementary sex-based classification, which gives social goods to those that identify with and use the pronouns that they were assigned at birth, but doesn't give social goods to those who are maybe transgender or non-binary and don't identify with those pronouns. And it builds connections, interestingly, between the idea of this very rigid idea of pronouns and non-discrimination, as it says that a lack thereof of confusion by having these rigid definitions prevents sex-based discrimination. So here I have the same idea of pronouns, but under the Obama administration. So as you can see, the significance here is that pronouns and refusal to use preferred pronouns is illegal sex-based discrimination, and that going about these practices will be considered as such, therefore validating the identities of not only transgender patients, but also the discrimination that they face, and creating relationships between the idea of using proper pronouns in the healthcare setting, and if not doing so, creating a sufficiently hostile environment. Therefore, equating social goods to those that don't necessarily identify in the same way that they would need to in the Trump document with that biological born at sex identification, and building connections between the idea of not using proper pronouns and conducting illegal sex-based discrimination. So as I said earlier, there were three main categories of difference that I found between the Trump and Obama administration documents. So the first is gender, and within this is the idea of gender identity, gender dysphoria, and pronoun use. So in the Obama administration, there's a really heavy emphasis on self-expression, and there's forceful language on the legitimacy of gender identity and gender dysphoria. And there's a recognition of discrimination against those who have different gender identities from that very traditional, well, traditional is not the right word, but that very born at sex, biological based gender identity. And there's a recognition of a need for treatment of gender dysphoria. Whereas in the Trump administration, there's a real emphasis on the rights of the medical professional to decide if gender dysphoria treatment needs to happen or if someone's gender identity is legitimate. And there's an emphasis on confusions and system inefficiency when using pronouns that more properly align with a person's identification. And there's unclear language on the necessity and legitimacy of treatment for gender dysphoria. However, both have really unclear implementation of how to go about properly validating people's gender identity within the healthcare system, and both have really unclear systems of accountability if transgender patients are discriminated against for their identity. So within discrimination, it's really fascinating the way that the two documents use the words burden and discrimination. So in the Obama administration, there's a heavy emphasis on patients, so specifically transgender patients, facing the burden within the healthcare system. Where in the Trump administration, there's a heavy emphasis on providers having the burden on them when they have to treat transgender patients. In the Obama administration, there's clear definitions of discrimination against transgender patients. However, there's vague language in implementing anti-discriminatory practices. Whereas in the Trump administration, there's a focus on religious and conscience laws. So those are laws that allow medical providers to not engage in gender transition treatments because of moral or religious grounds. And there's strong implementation language on how to create those protections so that providers aren't discriminated against if they refuse to treat transgender patients. However, once again, there's really unclear systems of how to combat the discrimination against transgender patients in both the Obama and Trump administrations. The Obama administration says that it's bad, but uses pretty vague language in how to go about combating this. So finally, there is this idea of sex. So this is important because a lot of the main difference between the Obama and Trump administration documents in their founding is that the Obama administration says that discrimination on the basis of sex includes gender identity. So that's including transgender patients, whereas the Trump administration says that on the basis of sex only includes that really binary definition. And therefore doesn't include gender identity. So as I said, with the Obama administration, there's a real fluidity in what the idea of on the basis of sex means. And this is based in cultural and scientific studies that also have a strong emphasis on creating a more inclusive idea of on the basis of sex to promote patient care and positive cultures in healthcare settings. Whereas the Trump administration has a rigidity around the idea of on the basis of sex and who gets to be protected under that idea of on the basis of sex discrimination, and has a strong emphasis on justifying this with words like scientific rationality and reality, which arguably are not necessarily true, but come up very often in the documents. However, both argue that their definition for on the basis of sex are for purpose of anti-discrimination. The Obama administration saying that a more inclusive definition is necessary for this anti-discrimination, whereas the Trump administration saying that a more rigid definition means a lack thereof of confusion, which means that there's going to be less room for essentially discrimination to slip through the cracks. So conclusions, language matters. That seems a little bit obvious from my presentation, but the way that the Obama administration validates the identities of transgender patients and recognizes the discrimination that they face is really important in implementing and showing the necessity of anti-discriminatory practices when treating transgender patients. However, there's a real lack thereof of authority in the Obama administration about how to go about combating anti-discriminatory practices and or discriminatory practices. And there's also a lack there of authority in the necessity more broadly of having immediate action against this, which I argue that this lack there of authority in language sets precedents that allow for that more blatant discrimination to come through in the Trump documents. So part of my papers, giving policy proposals. And I just want to say that this is within the section 1557. This is not policy proposals for transgender healthcare more broadly, and also it's a complicated subject, and every individual is different, but just within this document, these are the patterns that I noticed that I think would be helpful when potentially trying to recraft this document. So the first is avoiding those blanket statements. In both documents, especially in the Obama document, they kind of just say, discrimination against transgender patients. Discrimination against transgender patients is bad, but don't really go into the specifics of that, and don't go into the specifics about how to combat that. Secondly, there needs to be clear language about hospital protocols, having to give proper identification and institute anti-discriminatory practices, and language that they have to follow in order to combat this discrimination against transgender patients. The science around the necessity of gender reaffirming treatment from a broad range of surgery to therapy needs to be validated. And there needs to be language around anti-discriminatory practices, not just around gender transition and gender affirming treatment, but also in all healthcare services as transgender patients face discrimination across the board. And there needs to be clear systems of accountability for those that discriminate against transgender patients. And all of this has to happen in heavy collaboration and input from those within the community, as they're the ones that are the experts on it. They're the ones that know the problems that they face. And there often hasn't been a real room for that voice, the voice of the transgender community when creating these policies. So these are my references, and I just want to acknowledge Professor Crystal Littlejohn for her wonderful mentorship, the Oregon Humanities Center and the Humanities Undergrad Research Fellowship, Carl Resner and the other HERF panelists for their guidance and kindness and feedback, and the University of Oregon for the funding, and those that organized the Undergrad Research Conference. I will take questions in the Q&A and after, but thank you.
Thanks, Maya. Starla, Chambrose is our next speaker.
All right. Good morning. My name is Starla Chambrose, and I will be presenting my research paper titled A History of Muscular Dystrophy, the Biosocial Nature of Disease. And this research was conducted under the guidance of Dr. Arafat Aliani in the Department of History. So first, just to provide some background, muscular dystrophy, or MD, is actually an umbrella term that is used in the present day by both lay people and doctors to describe over 40 diseases caused by mutations in potentially more than 40 genes. But in everyday language, most people use muscular dystrophy to refer to the dystrophinopathies, which include Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or DMD, and Becker muscular dystrophy, or BMD. And the Duchenne type is the most common form of the disease, with the Becker form being just kind of a milder version of the Duchenne. And today, doctors would describe the cause of DMD and BMD as the result of a mutation in the dystrophin gene, which produces the protein in pink there, which is responsible for connecting the cell membrane of a muscle cell to its cytoskeleton, which is basically responsible for giving the cell structure. And so if you can't make that protein, your cell membrane is more subject to wear and tear as your muscles contract, which eventually allows toxins to enter the cell, and then the cells die off. So although muscular dystrophy is a thriving area of research for scientists, little work has been done to move studies of MD beyond the biomedical and into a cultural context. Most of the research on the disease by humanities scholars has focused on studying either muscular dystrophy advocacy groups or the lives of patients themselves. And then other histories of muscular dystrophy written by scientists have mostly focused on just describing a timeline of important discoveries. And while these are both definitely important areas of research, there's a glaringly obvious gap in our understanding of how MD has changed in the eyes of biomedical professionals. And arguably their perspective is the most important, as they are the primary actors involved in creating how the rest of the world views muscular dystrophy as a disease too. So as such, my research aimed to answer this question: how and why have biomedical professionals' understanding of muscular dystrophy changed over time? So answering this question demonstrates that science does not just exist in a vacuum. It is subject to social, cultural, and even political contexts. And so this lens can be described as one of co-production, which was coined by Sheila Jasanoff, and she describes it as the idea that science both embeds and is embedded in social practices, identities, norms, conventions, discourses, instruments, and institutions. In short, all the building blocks of what we term the social. So to understand how scientists think of muscular dystrophy today, it's important to start at what's recognized as the very beginning of the recorded history of MD. So from 1836 to 1851, various physicians documented cases of muscular dystrophy. Gaetano Conte focused on the clinical presentation of the disease. Richard Partridge, about a decade later, was actually able to look at autopsy results and examine the muscle tissue of a patient, but only on a macroscopic level. And then in the same year, William Little was able to give a very limited microscopic analysis of a DMD patient's muscle tissues. And then finally, it wasn't until 1851 that the English physician Edward Marion gave what is believed to be the first complete histological analysis, and histological referring to the study of tissues. And today, most people that have written about the subject, including scientists, give Marion credit for being the true discoverer of the disease. But the reason that it is called Duchenne muscular dystrophy instead of Marion muscular dystrophy, to keep a long story short, is because Guillaume Duchenne, who didn't observe a case of muscular dystrophy until the late 1850s, was basically able to cover up Marion's work. But the question that I was interested in was, how did he manage to do so? And ultimately, I discovered that to explain his success, we have to trace the history of both microscopy and histology. So after the deaths of the classical microscopists, by the 1810s, the microscope was no longer seen as a tool for real science. It was kind of just a gentleman's toy, a hobby instrument. But a dramatic improvement to the microscope in 1826, followed by the publication of the first English language microscopic analysis of tissue anatomy in 1844, slowly led to the acceptance of microscopy in London. And histology was finally taught in London medical schools in 1854, but it didn't become its own subject taught in medical schools for about another 10 to 20 years. So microscopy finally became firmly established as a respectable way of collecting data in London, where Marion worked, by the late 1850s and early 1860s, which notably was after he presented his findings on muscular dystrophy. In Paris, where Duchenne worked, they were suspicious of the microscope for even longer. In 1855, which was between the time that Marion and Duchenne published their separate pieces on muscular dystrophy, Duchenne actually scolded Marion for relying too much on his microscopic findings instead of the clinical findings, and basically he successfully discredited him. And at the same time, in the same year, a series of debates in Paris about the value of microscopy and whether or not it should be taught in medical schools was coming to a close, with those against using the instrument emerging as the clear winners, as microscopy and histology were not taught in Paris medical schools until the late 1860s. And not so coincidentally, at that same time, Duchenne finally gave some microscopic analysis himself, but by then Marion had already been forgotten about. But one last question I had from this was, why today is Marion being credited with the discovery? While he was the first to provide a detailed microscopic analysis, he certainly wasn't the first to describe the disease. But the scientists who rediscovered Marion's work at the end of the 20th century basically said that without muscle biopsy, it's impossible to know for certain whether any of the doctors before Marion actually described muscular dystrophy and not some other disease. So since microscopy is still a well-respected instrument today, and especially at the end of the 20th century, it remains the primary way of diagnosing muscular dystrophy, this is ultimately an example of modern technologies changing our view of the past. And in short, a series of cultural changes led to the emergence of a new field of study, tissue analysis via the microscope, which in the present day influences what it means to discover the disease. And this trend of the importance of new technologies influencing our perception of the disease is also important when considering how the history of muscular dystrophy diagnosis has changed. Since the late 19th century, We've gone from using muscle biopsies to blood tests for CK enzyme levels. So CK stands for creatine phosphokinase, and it's an enzyme in the blood. And today we use DNA sequencing. And now DNA sequencing is kind of the gold standard. It's the only accepted way to diagnose muscular dystrophy. But the changes in diagnostic technologies have actually changed our understanding of what muscular dystrophy is fundamentally, which might seem a bit backwards because generally we think that we would need to define the disease first before we're able to correctly diagnose it. But the process works in reverse as well. And you can make this argument for each of the new technologies that have emerged since muscle biopsy. But for simplicity, just focusing on the most recent technology, DNA sequencing, as an example, in Western medicine, this philosophy of methodological reductionism, which is the idea that going smaller and smaller will somehow reveal more accurate or more truthful truths, was one of the drivers of the Human Genome Project, which was a project in the 90s and early 2000s to sequence an entire human genome. And this project ultimately led to widespread cost-effective DNA sequencing. And this new technology eventually became an accepted way of knowing truth, an acceptable way of collecting data and using it to explain disease phenomena. And finally, that has allowed scientists to make new categories of disease. Diseases that would have been diagnosed as the Duchenne type of muscular dystrophy before, based on their clinical presentation, muscle biopsies, and CK tests, which are no longer sufficient for diagnosis on their own, are now considered to be different diseases. So, for example, the discovery of many of the autosomal dystrophies that present clinically, microscopically, and even enzymatically are now not characterized as Duchenne, and that would not have been possible without the development of this new diagnostic test. So we can take these ideas, along with my findings about how microscopy has influenced who we credit with the discovery of the disease, and put them into this larger framework. And we can say that culture and changes in society ultimately affects what are deemed legitimate ways of knowing or correct ways of knowing, which in turn outlines the boundaries of what is considered a specific disease. So in summary, I'd like to end with a thought from scholar Hans-Jörg Weinberger, who coined this idea of epistemic things, which he says are material entities or processes, including biological functions, that constitute the objects of inquiry. As epistemic objects, they present themselves in a characteristic, irreducible vagueness. This vagueness is inevitable because, paradoxically, epistemic things embody what one does not yet know. And muscular dystrophy is one of these epistemic things. As for scientific researchers, it is both the target of inquiry, yet it is also simultaneously defined in relationship to scientists' concerns. So as such, how biomedical professionals define the disease is intimately dependent on how they are influenced by the world around them. And it's clear that underlying the entire history of MD research is this narrative of emerging technologies, the development of microscopy, CK serum assays, and genetic tests, each of which emerged from their own sociopolitical contexts that are worth exploring with this kind of co-production lens, not only created and reflected changing attitudes about how to know, but also about what there is to know. And these technologies quite literally changed what muscular dystrophy is at a fundamental level, as muscular dystrophy exists as a category of disease only because various social processes have led to the development of technologies that have led scientists to deem it as such. So here are some of the references that I consulted. But finally, I'd just like to end with thanking my primary advisor, Dr. Arafat Valiani, and then the other two members of my thesis committee, Dr. Amy Connolly and Dr. Roxanne Prasniak. Also Dr. Marnie Westerfield for putting me into contact with Dr. Lou Kunkel, who I had the chance to interview for my research. And finally, everyone involved in the Humanities Undergraduate Research Fellowship for sponsoring my project. And I'd be happy to take questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Starla. Our next speaker is Cassie Cole.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cassie, and today I'll be presenting on my research on cultural gatekeeping in the Vietnamese community. So cultural gatekeeping is the act of creating in-groups and out-groups within a racial or ethnic group to determine who belongs in and who belongs out, creating in-groups and out-groups. And these are often personal guidelines and barriers that people are using to create these in-groups and out-groups. And so my research is going to look at why people do this and who's being impacted by this. My research focuses specifically on the Vietnamese community just to have a narrowed, smaller research pool, as well as my own personal connections to the community. Cultural gatekeeping is also known as identity denial or identity invalidation or rejection, which kind of gives you a better understanding of the weight of being denied your identity and being denied of who you are. For a little bit of background, I used critical race theory and Asian critical theories to examine my data. Critical race theory is used to examine racial oppression against racial minorities and injustice against racial minorities in white society, to look at their lived experiences and to use those lived experiences to speak out against oppression and empower those racial minorities. And Asian critical theories look specifically at the Asian experience. And so cultural gatekeeping is very heavily dependent on stereotypes, and stereotypes in turn are dependent on media framing. So what we see in the media, what the media tells us to think and how they portray certain groups of people influence how we think of those people and therefore how we treat those people in turn. And so stereotypes are a big component of cultural gatekeeping. Cultural identity, as I briefly mentioned in the last slide, very important to who someone is, as well as how they're seen by the world and how you want to be seen by the world. And lastly, intersectionality is the convergence of social identities. These identities can't really be separated, they're part of who you are, and intersectionality is just how those identities interact with each other and play out in your life. My research questions today are: one, how does cultural gatekeeping play out in the lived experiences of Vietnamese identifying individuals? Who participates in cultural gatekeeping against Vietnamese identifying individuals, and why people engage in cultural gatekeeping, and what are their influences? My method for my research, I created an anonymous Qualtrics survey that was IRB approved, and they went out specifically to Vietnamese identifying people. I had the survey tested. It's just 16 short questions. It was approximately a 5-minute survey, and I had several people test out the questions beforehand, and my questions were based on prior research to cultural gatekeeping that I read in my literature review. And so my 16 questions were related to cultural gatekeeping, so people's experiences with it, both as someone who has been kept out of a culture or someone who is participating in the gatekeeping itself, as well as some personal profile questions, including gender, location, and age. The survey was distributed through the Facebook group Subtle Viet Traits, which is a group of over 100,000 Vietnamese identifying members from around the world. I thought this was a great place to kind of spread out my survey and get a wide variety of responses from people. And I used the hermeneutic phenomenological analysis technique to analyze my survey responses and look for patterns, common responses, and anomalies. The screenshot here is just an example of the question I asked people in my survey just to verify that they were Vietnamese identifying, because that was my target audience. So my survey findings, I received 176 complete responses from people in 9 different countries around the world. You can see a map here of the distribution of my responses. The larger points on the map are where I received the most responses. I believe 140 responses or so came from the United States. So that was my largest pool, but they came from 9 different countries. So it was very cool to see the different experiences that people are having and sharing around the world. Of my findings, I found that 75% of my respondents believe that cultural gatekeeping happens somewhat or very often when I ask them about their familiarity with the concept and how often they think it occurs. 49% of my respondents have participated in cultural gatekeeping as someone who is keeping someone out of their culture, even though 82% of the respondents have experienced cultural gatekeeping themselves, meaning that the people who are experiencing this phenomenon are also the ones participating in it. They're on 2 sides of the coin, and they're contributing to it even though they're being impacted by it as well. I asked my respondents some sample phrases that people may have said to them indicating cultural gatekeeping. These phrases are based on personal experience, things I've heard from other people, as well, again, from my background research on cultural gatekeeping. And so people could select these responses, and they could also input their own responses in other to provide a better understanding of the kind of experiences they had. And as you can see, they're not very positive. So cultural gatekeeping isn't a very great experience. And so going off of that, I asked people to also let me know what their reactions were to experiencing cultural gatekeeping. And they, again, had some options to choose, but they could also put in other to explain how they felt on a personal level. This word cloud here is in the shape of the Vietnamese flag. And the words that are larger are the words that came up more often. So you can see they're largely negative with how people are reacting to cultural gatekeeping, things like isolated, angry, hurt, distressed, offended, people just generally not enjoying the cultural gatekeeping experience, which I found very interesting, especially because some of my respondents said that when they were gatekeeping someone else, it was seen as a joke, it was casual, it wasn't meant to be taken as an offensive statement, but still people are being upset by this. So I think it's important to note that your words have power, especially when you're attacking someone directly at their identity, which is often the core of a person. To go back to my research question, I asked who participates in cultural gatekeeping. So I specifically asked my respondents to list the relation to the person they were speaking with. And about 70% of my respondents said it was someone that they knew, a family member, an acquaintance, a friend, someone that they've had a prior interaction with before, still attacking their identity. And so it shows that really anyone can participate in cultural gatekeeping. And going forward as well, I asked them the age of the gatekeeper as well. And about 70% again were between the ages of 18 and 60 years old. So this really can be anyone in any environment. I found two major themes in the why of cultural gatekeeping, physical appearance and cultural factors. I have some quotes here that I took out from my responses of people when they were able to fill in the blanks on how they felt about it. Physical appearance often had to do with hair color, skin color, especially people who are biracial and have multiple cultural background, so they might look different and not pure. And so people saying you do not look Vietnamese, you look too pale to be Asian, Twinkie, where you're yellow on the outside, white on the inside. So people having these negative appearances just simply based on how they look. You can't really control that. And even if you do, you can't really judge someone based off of their physical appearance, as well as cultural factors. So people who didn't speak the language, who didn't speak it as fluently, who either didn't like the culture or had no knowledge of the culture. And for that reason, they were kept out of the Vietnamese community as well. And as we go into my discussion here, I think it's important to look at why this is happening. And a lot of it has to do with white society. In the media, white society is dominant. It's what people strive for. We see that in TV, in our TV shows, in the news, everything. It's what people try to aim for, especially immigrants as they come to the United States, strive to be American. And that's why people might change the way they look, they might change the way they act in an effort to fit in. And so going back to critical race theory and Asian critical theories, it's because of white society that people try to change who they are and try to fit in in the best way that they can in order to survive. So continuing my discussion, when I asked how does cultural gatekeeping play out in the lived experiences of Vietnamese identifying individuals, well, it's very common for them, 84% saying that they have experienced some sort of cultural gatekeeping. So this is a very common experience for Vietnamese people. And then their reactions, overwhelmingly negative responses to gatekeeping. People don't like it when they're told that their identity and who they believe they are is incorrect. Anyone can participate in cultural gatekeeping. It can be someone you know, it could be someone your age, or it could be someone way older than you. So it could really be anyone. And then why do people participate? Again, like white society, Americanization. A lot of people saying that they gatekept other people because they were too Americanized, they were too whitewashed, or the way that they looked was too Americanized as well, or an equivalent based on the country that the person was from. And so I think it's interesting to look further into that and say, well, why is Americanization a bad thing? And why are people switching to Americanization? Future research, I would love to look at a larger sample size survey just to look at more people, different cultural groups as well. It'd be interesting to compare rates of cultural gatekeeping among different groups. I'd also like to look at more of the why of cultural gatekeeping. Why do people do this? How does this carry forward into their life, into how they portray themselves to the public, and how this has impacted who they see themselves as? And then also I would like to mix methods for a deeper analysis, and this may include doing interviews rather than surveys to provide a more in-depth response, or it could include asking more questions for a longer survey. And that was my research. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Donalyn Pomper, my faculty mentor, for her constant support and guidance, the Humanities Undergraduate Research Fellowship for their funding and guidance, the School of Journalism and Communication at the UO, and the University of Oregon South for providing research and funding opportunities like her for their students. Here are my references, and thank you all very much. I'll be taking questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Cassie. Our next speaker is Abigail Kellems.
Hello, my name is Abigail Kellems. I'm an undergraduate student here studying music composition, and my faculty advisor is Dr. Robert Keir. The topic that I'll be presenting on today is American women that are driving classical music and environmentalism forward in the 21st century. So a little bit of background about the topic of American women in classical music. Until the 1980s, American women were discouraged from composing professionally. They were encouraged to get a little music education, maybe become fairly proficient performers, but mostly for entertainment purposes because it made them more attractive to suitors. They were barred from getting any higher music education. They didn't have the same opportunities as their male peers. The pieces that they wrote about the environment were limited in scope. Because they lacked the freedoms and resources to travel to larger iconographic natural areas like the ocean, the mountains that their male peers could. So they mostly wrote shorter pieces about elements of nature that were more accessible to them, like streams, butterflies, birds, that kind of thing. Although in the 1980s, American women began to access higher music education and training, as recently as the 2014-2015 season, 98% of the programming of America's most prominent orchestras, of the 21 most prominent orchestras in America, was dedicated to male composers. Only 11% of the pieces performed were by living composers, 85% of which were by men. A little bit of background about women in the environment. Women experience the negative effects of climate change more than men do. 80% of the people displaced by climate change are women. They are also more at risk when climate disasters strike to be physically harmed, to lose their jobs and their income. These problems are connected. The same systemic issues and barriers that are preventing women from gaining careers as composers in classical music are also literally putting them at higher risk due to the climate crisis. So for this project, I looked at women who are working towards change. I looked at American women just to narrow the scope of the project. And although there are many people from many different countries across the gender spectrum, I chose 6 women whose projects were interesting to me, who are still alive, who are composing today, and who are very innovative. I'll be discussing 4 of them in this presentation due to time constraints. But these women range in age from 33 to 78. For this project, I was able to get in touch with a few of the composers directly, the benefit of studying living people. I also conducted score analyses when it was appropriate of an environmental piece by each of these women who write environmental music, as well as auditory analysis of their works. So the first woman that I looked at is Gabriella Lena Frank. She is 49 years old. She's actually the only woman included in the study who doesn't write environmental music. She is a composer, virtuosic pianist, and educator from California. She considered herself a casual environmentalist until she began experiencing the extreme California wildfires that have been happening these past 2 years. And in 2016, she established the Gabriella Lena Frank Creative Academy of Music in order to support young, diverse, emerging artists and bring music into communities. One of their focuses is climate citizenship. They're committed to taking meaningful action to protect the environment by reducing the carbon footprint of performance practice and engaging with climate scientists to create works of art that reflect the global climate crisis. She's also created a climate blog that directs musicians towards resources that they can use in their specific profession to reduce their carbon imprint. For example, if a person is an administrator, they might direct them towards resources they can use to source food for concert functions sustainably, or if the musician goes out on tour, there are resources to streamline their tour route so that they don't use as much gas. She also established the Composing Earth Project, which mentors young composers for 2 years. In the first year, they study the climate crisis with Frank and with climate scientists. And in the second year, they're commissioned to create a piece of music that reflects what they learned in the first year. The second woman I looked at is Paola Prestini. She is a composer and impresario, which is someone who organizes concerts and events. She was born in Italy, but was raised in southern Arizona, close to the Mexican border. She founded the art production company Vision into Art, as well as the National Sawdust Performance Venue, which promotes works by emerging artists. Many of her pieces contain sounds of nature. She samples birdsong in some of them. And she's been creating music for documentaries about the environment, such as the Amazon and the Colorado. The piece of hers that I looked at for this project is from the film The Colorado, which is a documentary that stands alone, but also has a version where it is played behind a live performing orchestra. 5 composers were commissioned for this project, and Prestini was one of them. So they show the documentary with images of the Colorado River and its cultural history behind them, and a live orchestra, well, a vocal octet with cello and percussion performs music in front of it. The piece that I looked at for this project is called Chapter 2, A Padre, a Horse, and a Telescope, and it explores the Spanish arrival in Lower California, the conversion of indigenous peoples to Catholicism, the discovery that Lower California was a peninsula and not an island. So while the vocal octet and the chamber group is performing the music in front of the documentary, there are images of the desert and of the Roman Catholic missions that were established in that area during that time. The next composer I looked at is Ellen Reed, who is 38. She is a composer, sound artist, film composer, and educator who is from Tennessee, but is now based in Los Angeles and New York City. Along with fellow composer Missy Mazzoli, she established the Luna Composition Lab, which focuses on mentoring young female and non-binary composers. And in her music, she creates a direct connection between her audience and nature, especially in her project, the Ellen Reed Sound Walk, which started in 2020 and is an ongoing project. It's a GPS-enabled musical experience where she created 100 cells or snippets of music and then geocoded them to different areas. And the listener downloads an app on their phone and they plug in their headphones. And then as they go through a walk through Central Park, for example, the music will change as they walk down different paths and approach different areas. She used a mix of tonal music and atmospheric music for this. And she's created sound walks in Griffith Park in LA and Central Park, New York City, several locations in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and it's really exciting. This summer, she's launching one in Jacksonville, Oregon, which is about 2.5 hours from Eugene, if anyone's interested. The next composer I looked at is Tonya Ko, who is 33. She is a composer, a sound artist, a visual artist, and an educator who was born in Hong Kong, but was raised in Hawaii, attended school in America. I believe she's now practicing in the United Kingdom. But she inspires activism by instilling a deep appreciation for nature in her audience. And she does this by creating site-specific pieces that are designed to be performed outside in nature. The piece of hers that I looked at for this project is called Plain Air, written in 2018 for string quartet, as well as electronics and room for sounds of nature to make their way into the music. It was created for the Open Lands Nature Preserve in Michigan. And it begins with a sound walk where the musicians play their instruments and they lead the audience members through the preserve. And she created electronic music and placed like 19 different speakers throughout the preserve. So the listeners could hear those as well as they walked by. And through this piece, she hoped to show that all of the tiny things in nature are connected and they work together, and therefore we collectively can do a lot of good for the environment. Something really cool about this piece is that it's designed to be performed both at the preserve, as you can see here, the sound walk, and the outdoor performance venue, and in a concert hall. So it's very flexible. What I found is that They are working climate activism into their art in really meaningful ways. Some focus on reducing their climate footprints and the more logistic and performance practice side of things. Some use their music as a vehicle to deliver information about environmental issues, and they use their platforms to elevate the voices of experts. For example, Gabrielle and Lena Frank bringing in climate experts to talk to musicians. Some invite climate experts to speak at their concerts. And they also create direct connections between their audience and nature. For example, creating pieces that bring their audience outside. They're also making important advancements in the field of classical music by creating pieces that are designed to be performed outdoors, which is a newer idea. They're creating multimedia experiences that illustrate the climate crisis, such as Paolo Cristini's work with the climate documentaries about the Colorado River. Many of these pieces are conceived with sustainability in mind. They're using extended techniques and developing new techniques to express their perceptions of the environment. And something important that they're all doing is mentoring young composers and musicians to create a more sustainably minded next generation of musicians and composers. I'd like to acknowledge my faculty advisor, Dr. Robert Keir, as well as the University of Oregon and the Humanities Undergraduate Research Fellowship, and all the people involved in that for their support and their funding for this project. My references, image sources. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Abigail. Our next speaker is Sabrina Piccolo.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to keep this brief just because I know that Jude has to present as well, and his research is quite neat. So I also want to make sure there's time for that. Is everybody seeing this, hearing this okay?
Yep.
Okay, just making sure. I can't see y'all. Okay, so my name is Sabrina. I have been working on my honors thesis called The Effects of Accent Perception on the Perception of Professionalism. I've been working on this under the guidance of my mentor, Dr. Melissa Baisberg, in the linguistics department. So to understand the basics of why I even approached this topic, it's important to understand a bit of the background and the context in which I'm writing this. Simply put, sociolinguistic research highlights that the ways that we perceive accents are direct reflections of the ways that we perceive the people who use those accents. However, accent discrimination continues to be a heavily overlooked topic, and it does provide a lot of leeway for discrimination in other aspects, whether it's race, socioeconomic status, or place of birth. We also see, especially recently, a lot more research discussing the role that accent perception plays in the workplace, from the process of job interview success to successful upward mobility in the workplace. Even more recently, we see a lot more research and literature on how accent perception plays a role in court cases and in the courtroom, from the process of jury selection to the ways that jurors perceive witnesses and how that can end up shaping the results of a court case. Finally, it's important to note that a lot of research now has been pointing out the ways that accent perception can affect perceptions of credibility and believability, and how much we believe people in general, especially when it comes to non-native English speakers. So this then led me to my research question. How are the perceptions of a speaker's accent related to perceptions of the speaker's professionalism, confidence, believability, knowledgeability, and level of experience? In other words, how do the ways that we perceive accents affect even more specific traits that are often put on a pedestal in formal settings? For my study, I recruited 256 native English speakers who live in the United States. Each participant listened to two speakers. One was a bilingual Spanish speaker, and the other was a monolingual English speaker. As I said, each participant listened to both speakers, and each speaker was described first as an expert or a non-expert in whatever they were talking about, and then they ended up talking about either Mexican history or marine biology. At the end of listening to each speaker, the participants rated each speaker on a Likert scale from 1 to 9 in regards to professionalism, confidence, believability, knowledgeability, and experience. So something kind of like the sample question that I have here. At the very end of the study, as my own sort of side quest, I wanted to see how much did the participants remember from their speaker's content. So you can basically see this as a memory test that they answered in regards to what the speakers were talking about. So there are really three main areas of results that I want to talk about here. And although I haven't done a full statistical analysis quite yet, examining the data does reveal some interesting details. So first of all, we find that as a whole, in general, the monolingual speaker was rated higher than the bilingual speaker in professionalism and confidence, as we can see here. This means that the bilingual speaker, on the other hand, was rated higher in those last three areas: believability, knowledgeability, and experience. I then wanted to kind of zoom in and see where specifically was the bilingual speaker rated particularly high in those last three sections. And it turned out to be the case that they were rated higher, the highest in those last three sections, when they were described as a non-expert and when they were discussing Mexican history. In regards to the memory test, all across the board, most all of the charts looked like this for all the combinations, regardless of expertise, regardless of the topic being discussed. Simply put, more questions were answered correctly when the content was spoken by the monolingual speaker, as opposed to the bilingual Spanish speaker. So this brings up some interesting questions, and especially in regards to how we apply them in professional settings. We see that from this study, professionalism and confidence aren't quite correlated with believability, knowledgeability, and experience, which came as a surprise to me. I would expect that all five of those traits would have been rated very similarly, but we see that professionalism and confidence are rated very differently from those three. And I think to put that in perspective, one way that we could see this is that, in a job interview, we could be listening to someone, seeing them and view them as believable, knowledgeable, and experienced in whatever they're discussing, but still not see them as professional or confident. And I think that professionalism term is particularly important here, considering that this is a term that we often highlight in formal settings. Second, we see that assumptions about believability, knowledgeability, and experience may be affected by the assumptions we make about the relationships between accents and cultures. In this case, I would hypothesize that the non-expert discussing Mexican history was rated so highly in those last three sections because of the assumptions that the listeners are making about the relationship between the speaker's accent and the culture and history of a largely Spanish-speaking country, in this case, Mexico. Finally, we see that how much a listener retains from a speaker may not be directly related to how they perceive believability, knowledgeability, and experience. So in regards to sort of the memory test, we see that someone may remember not very much from what they listened to, from what the speaker was saying, but they may still see the speaker as believable, knowledgeable, and experienced, regardless of how much they remember that they were talking about. All of my work was not created in a vacuum. I have relied heavily on other texts and modern research in the past decade regarding this topic, especially as the issue of accent discrimination becomes more prevalent and more widely discussed. I also think it's really important to discuss that none of my work has been created solo. I extend my gratitude to Dr. Melissa Bays-Burke as my advisor, as my mentor, and for her continued guidance throughout the project. I also want to thank the Humanities Undergraduate Research Fellowship for its feedback and for making research in undergrad a financially and academically achievable goal. Finally, I want to thank my speech perception and production lab members for their continued time, feedback, and patience for every single step of this research. And I mean every single step. There's not a single part of this study that's been done completely alone. And with that, I will hand this off to our last presenter, I believe.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. And as Sabrina has said, yes, we are now at our last speaker, and that speaker is Jude Stone.
Thank you. Yeah, and Sabrina, you did a great job speaking quickly, but being very thorough. So I'll try and follow in those footsteps. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hi, my name is Jude Stone, and I'll be presenting my senior thesis, which is titled Racial Influence on Trans-femme Homicide Convictions. So my research is really looking at two primary issues. And the first is that BIPOC trans-femme people, so to break that down a little bit, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And trans-femme people, in my study, I'm defining as people who were assigned male at birth, but who identified or presented as either trans women or gender non-conforming people. So that could be drag queens or non-binary people at the time that they were killed. So BIPOC trans femme people are killed at rates roughly 3 times higher than the national average in the US. And the way that the law treats trans people creates a culture of devaluing their lives, whether that's through police discrimination or through police profiling or legal discrimination. And then the second main issue is that BIPOC cisgender men, so cisgender meaning not trans, BIPOC men are policed, arrested, and incarcerated at rates approximately 5 times higher than white men in the US. And previous studies have already shown that BIPOC men, particularly Black and Latino men, are routinely criminalized and treated worse throughout every aspect of the legal system than white people are. So what I was really looking at was how courts policed each of these groups when they're on either side of a case. So with the trans femme people as the victims and the BIPOC men as the defendants. And I just want to clarify here that I'm using the term victim in the legal sense only. I don't want to apply the word victim to the trans femme people in any other context because it erases their resistance and their agency. But my primary research question sums up into how do defendants and victims' races impact convictions with trans femme homicide cases? So in other words, when a trans femme person was killed, how did the race of the defendant and the victim influence if the defendant was found guilty or if they were found not guilty? And also if they were convicted, what sort of verdict they got? So was it a murder conviction? Was it a manslaughter conviction? And so on. So some really quick background that I think is important for my research is that the law is used to maintain social order by criminalizing certain groups of people as deviant. So the law heavily associates queer people and especially trans people with narratives that paint them as sexually depraved, predatory, deceitful, and mentally deranged. And that's especially true for BIPOC trans femme people. And throughout my research and previous research that I looked at, I broke how the law defines deviance into 3 main groups, which is criminality, sexuality, and poverty, which we see with not only trans people, but also for how the law casts BIPOC men as criminals. It also casts them as thugs, lazy, hypersexual, and hyperviolent. And importantly, race and queerness are not constructs that are independent of each other. Historically, the US has defined queerness and race in conjunction to one another and in relation to one another, and it still does today. So that kind of helps contextualize why Black and Latina and just BIPOC in general, trans femme people are targeted so much by violence and dehumanization. So for my methods, I looked at every single homicide case that involved a trans femme victim since 2009 in the US. And 2009 I selected because that's when the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act was passed, which is the first hate crime law to include gender identity as a protected category. So I looked through 2021, and the races I looked at were Black, Latinx, and white, because unfortunately there were not enough data points of trans femme people or defendants who were Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, or Middle Eastern to identify demonstrable trends with that data. So these are like the 3 primary sources that I use. So on the left, you can see a news article. In the middle, you can see a case brief from one of the trial and appellate cases. And on the right, you can see the incarceration database. So in other words, it's like an inmate search database. So for my findings, the first main finding that I found that was really significant was about hate crimes. So actually only 4 cases of 103 were charged with hate crimes at all. And importantly, only 3 of them were actually convicted with hate crimes. One of them was on the basis of race, not gender identity. Another was on the basis of sexual orientation, and it was later overturned. So only 1 case out of 103 cases resulted in a hate crime conviction for gender identity bias, even though many defendants openly admitted to killing the trans femme person because they snapped when they found out that the person was trans. Another really important finding is that compared to the national average, defendants were 4 times more likely to risk trial in homicide cases when their victim was trans femme. So for a little bit of background on that, when someone is charged with a crime, to put it in simplistic terms, they can plead guilty or not guilty. And if they plead guilty, they can usually take a plea deal, meaning that they will receive a less harsh conviction or sentence by admitting their guilt. But if they choose to plead not guilty, then they go to trial, and then they risk being convicted much more harshly. But they also have the chance to be found not guilty and go free. So nationally, most people do plead guilty to get the lower conviction or charge. But here I found that 4 times more defendants were risking trial in cases with trans-femme victims, which suggests that, coupled with the amount of transphobia that we see in the criminal legal system in general, it suggests that defendants and their defense lawyers intentionally may have exploited their victims' gender identity to reduce or beat conviction. And even though I found that the acquittal rates were the same in my study and the national average, because more defendants were going to trial, 3 times more of them were ultimately acquitted and found not guilty in cases with trans-femme victims versus cisgender victims. So here are the findings I found, particularly regarding race. So ultimately, I found that the victims' races did have a larger impact on the convictions than defendants' races. So what this graph is saying, the orange bar is for conviction rates. And so what we can see here is that Black trans-femme victims, cases with those victims, were convicted much less frequently, and they resulted in more acquittals and mistrials than cases with white or Latinx victims. But here we can see of the cases that resulted in conviction, this kind of breaks down the exact verdict that they got. So when the victim was white, we can see on the left the blue bars for murder, which is the most harsh conviction you can get for the crime. So white victims received the most murder convictions. Latinx victims received less murder convictions than white victims and more middle charges, right? So manslaughter or lesser charges. And then we can see that Black trans-femme victims yielded the least amount, the fewest amount of murder convictions and the highest amount of manslaughter convictions, which kind of shows that even though these crimes were very similar, when the defendant killed a Black or Latinx victim, they just received a less harsh conviction. And something I wanted to touch on really quick was also that the defendant's race did still have an impact, although just less than the victim's race, because similarly situated Black defendants received harsher convictions than Latinx and white defendants when the victim's race was held constant. So what this kind of shows is how Blackness is just extremely devalued in the US, and especially within the criminal legal system. And being Latinx is also criminalized more than whiteness, whereas whiteness is socially valued the most. And this is particularly amplified when we look at cases with trans-femme people, where Black trans-femme victims seemed to receive the least amount of sympathy from judges and juries, whereas white trans-femme victims seem to receive the most. And I just wanted to take a moment to kind of have an in memoriam slide. These are actually not the people that I used in my case, but rather they're the people whose cases I looked at, whose perpetrators were never found, or they were killed by law enforcement, so the case was different. And then I just want to thank my thesis committee, the Center for Undergraduate Engagement, Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program, the Rabe family, and the Clark Honors College for providing me with so much support and funding throughout this entire process. So I'll be taking questions in the Q&A, and thank you.
Thanks, Jude, and thanks for all of our amazing presenters on this Humanities Undergraduate Research Fellowship panel, The Fate of the Humanities. I think you will see from the presentations that we've heard that the humanities are doing just fine. And I want to, again, thank everyone for participating. Unfortunately, we are now at the 10:30 mark, and I'm very sorry to say that we do not have time for any questions other than those that have come to us during the course of the presentations. I just want to thank again these amazing presenters. You guys did an incredible job. It has been such a pleasure to work with you, and it's just such impressive work. Thank you so much for everything that you've done, and congratulations.
Thank you, Dr. Peppis, for moderating as well.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome.
Thank you.
Take care, and thanks everybody for joining us.